says, my experience is from around, nearly, I have to say, nearly 10 years working in the field of e-participation, not just in the UK, but also through a number of European projects. So we work across Europe, and we accidentally got a Canadian client as well, but we didn't mean to do that. It was an accident. And what we do is we build civic social software. And at the same time as doing that, I'm also a doctoral researcher at the University of Sussex, looking at the more sort of theoretical elements of what it means that people increasingly live their lives online as well as offline. And what Mina is doing today with the webcast, we believe is very much how people live today, which is that they have a digital wrapper around their physical life. And so as I go into the presentation, actually the most significant thing about this, it isn't the technology, because the technology is constantly changing. It's the fact that people have accepted and embraced this digital wrapper to their lives, this digital element, and also the fact that they use it to come together. So it's not the information necessarily, and it's not the technology, it's the fact that people are collaborating more, people are coming together online. And I sort of used this example yesterday, but if the Middle East situation in Libya and Bahrain and Egypt tells us anything about the new world that we live in, it tells us that people want the networked effect even when you remove the technology. And that's the social change. So, I've not put a lot of statistics into the presentation, but the fact is that in every metric that you look at, there is upward growth of use of social media, of use of internet technologies. So there isn't anything that's coming out against the evidence base that says people are increasingly, both in terms of volume and in terms of time, the amount of their lives that they're spending online. And the consequence of that is what I'm calling, and well, not I, is what researchers are calling the network society. So a network society is where we are in a post-industrial and post-information age. It's where actually the significance is the connections between each other. And what this means is that there are huge pressures on the old ways of working. Now, in the UK, in England, we're rather overwhelmed by a terrible financial situation at the moment. It's a bit embarrassing because we've accidentally spent a lot more money than we actually have. But the fact is that the pressure of change from the way that society is moving is greater than that financial change. And that's what the opportunity here is as well, which is that you can start to think about what it means that people who are 20 years old today are starting to come into your workforce and are going to be the voters who are going to make the political decisions from this point going onwards. Because this millennial generation are used to the idea that if they want to know something, they check their phone. If they want to find their friends, they go on Facebook. And if they have a question, they throw it out to Twitter or something like that, and they get an immediate answer. Now, those are not just social patterns, those are the ways in which they're learning, and it's the ways in which they're going to be working. And so when we think about what does that mean for us as institutions, is we need to start finding a relevance in the way that we do business with these people that actually makes sense for them as well. And so this internet culture is colliding with our traditional structures. Now there's a lot about culture online, but the social web has a number of distinct characteristics which makes people online behave differently to the way that they behave offline. So for instance, there is a tendency to be more collaborative. People will tend to work more together online. There's a tendency towards participation. So more people actually create content and contribute online than offline. An example of this is the fact that increasingly news services, so in England that would be the BBC, will rely on user-generated content. If you look at the recent coverage of the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, you're seeing as much coverage from mobile phones and from citizen journalists as you are from the mainstream news. And often that's far more compelling. And because of that, is that the appetite for that grows and grows. The online culture also has an expectation of both openness and transparency. It is very difficult not to click the next link online. You must, it's happened to everybody, is you there, you look for one thing, and then there's another thing that's interesting, another thing, and the next thing you know, you're looking at something that's completely different. But that ability to click through and to find out more means that there is an expectation of transparency and that you can find out more. There's an expectation of publicness, that you know what is happening in people's lives and that people are reporting what's happening in their lives. Now, neither of those things are natural to government in most countries. And so when we talk about the collision of cultures, you need to consider what it means that the social web, the internet, the network generation is expecting this openness and transparency. And the last thing to say is that this is a culture which is naturally quite playful. It often has a humorous response to problems. It often reconciles differences in a humorous kind of way. And again, that can be quite at odds with the way that government often chooses to work. The final thing I'd say is that it's got an agility and a speed of movement which is very unfamiliar to government. It is online, you work in dog years. So your dog is 7 years old for every 1 year of your age. The internet is similarly that much faster. And so you need to find out the way in which you're going to be able to make your policy processes and your decision-making processes fast enough that and agile enough that you're going to be able to respond to that speed. Otherwise, you'll be designing technological solutions which are 7 years out of date before you finish them. And this question of agility is one which I think you need to keep coming back to, which is an understanding of your objective and a very pragmatic way of running towards your objective rather than forming the complete plan before you start working. And the question then, of course, is how should government respond? Because you do not have the luxury of sitting back and waiting to see what will happen, because you have considerable responsibilities around shaping this. So Manuel Castells is a fantastic researcher around this. He talks about the need to rebuild from the bottom up all of the mechanisms of government. Now, he's quite the radical, and I think that probably this is a little bit unachievable. But I think you should be considering this as being a complete programme of renewal, and that what you're trying to do is to make government ready to deal with this millennial generation. But in doing that, you've got considerable tensions that you need to balance. And one of the biggest one, I think, the biggest two on that would be the fact that you're used to having a lot of control. And I don't say you specifically, this is government is used to having a lot of control over what goes on, whereas the social web and the network society is demanding more involvement. And that really reconciles itself to a tension between the representative democracy that we all work with and the more direct democracy, which is both asked for and is facilitated by greater use of technology. And if we don't find the right role for the politicians in that tension, then what we're doing is we're risking overwhelming our representative democracy with direct tools. And I think that has to be, when you're thinking about how government needs to change, you need to be thinking about that tension in particular, because the last thing we want to do is to lose the democratic benefits which we've been living with for a considerable period of time, just because people can vote on X Factor or on Celebrity Big Brother online. There are other tensions here. And so one of the ones which I often highlight is the difference between the authenticated identity of the citizen offline and the fact that online identity is a changeable, malleable thing. People don't have to say who they are. And that's something which people like, and it's an element, an aspect of the playfulness of the social web. But in democratic terms, it's a norm that you're probably going to have to address, because democracy is about accountability. Ultimately, it's about one person having one vote, and those are ways in which those two worlds have got to come together. I think the other thing is this area of rather than giving our power to representatives, the social web is asking people to be far more involved in the co-production of decision making. And that can work to your advantage, because people are more willing, as I said earlier, to actually participate and to do things. So we're talking about the fact that people are going online not just to talk to their friends, not just to make kind of like cute cartoons of kittens on YouTube. You know, what they're going on and they're talking about their communities, they're talking about their local area. And they are using a variety of mainstream free tools to do this. And hopefully most of the logos there you'll be familiar with. The only one you may not know is Mumsnet, which is down at the bottom there. And I put that as an example because that's a community that was created by two mothers when they were at home from work after with their first children. And that's grown into a community, and they started it because they felt isolated and they felt that they didn't have enough of a connection to the community they were living in. But that now has thousands, tens of thousands of members, and Mumsnet is one of the first places that the government will go when it wants to consult about parenting issues. And that's a really good example of the kind of communities which start to come forward in this new world, which are communities which are pro-social. They have a civic purpose, and yet they're not controlled or managed by government. And one of the things which is my advice and our advice is to, where possible, encourage this to happen outside of your technology, outside of your control, because it's going to be more sustainable and it's going to be more authentic if you let people actually create this stuff for themselves. The minute that you step in and try and control it, you lose something of that sustainability. So what we're talking about is a circle which is where you're going beyond broadcasting to people, where you're trying to actually get into a conversation about actions with them, because actions are what's important in a faster moving world. And you're trying to create conversations. You're giving away some of your power. You're getting the benefit of a much more genuine connection with the public. And you're building these co-productive relationships, which is where you and the citizen are moving forward together to actually build things in parallel, in tandem. But it's important, though, that if we're saying that the government needs to move online, is that there are considerable risks with doing this. And one of the reasons that government defaults to a command and control way of working is that it means you can manage out much more of the risk. One way of looking at this is that we're moving from what was a Japanese production line way of working, which is where you have an idea, you build an idea, you test an idea, and then you deliver it to the public, to something which is much more iterative. It's a cycle. And what that means is that there are far more risks as you're going along because you have less control. You need to change your attitude to risk, and you need to change your relationship with the public around risk as well. And this is possibly the most difficult thing to do. Because on the one hand, we're saying that there's going to be far more openness and transparency. On the other hand, you are still government. And one of the tests of this kind of change is going to be the first time that a politician is able to change their mind and the public not to believe that that's a weakness. Now, at the moment, the press and the public will be very, very negative about the idea of a change in policy. However, a change in policy is often the rational reaction to a change in the facts. And it's that kind of increased maturity of the relationship that we're looking at, and those are the kind of risks as you develop that maturity of relationship, which are going to be there for you. That and the fact that people will start changing your slides and all these kind of things will happen.